where we're coming to you live from the YL conference.
In the IHWO Bristol Teachers Room. Hello, so my name is Charlie Marshall. I'm a teacher and a teacher trainer at IHWO Bristol, and I've been working here for about 11 years now. And as well as teaching, I teach on the junior courses in the summer, which is mostly teenagers. And I also do specialist courses in things like photography, journalism, video making, and science. And I'm responsible for most of the content, the free content on our school's website. But today I'm talking to you about how to motivate and activate your young learners, because this is something I think we have found out a lot about how to do in our summer courses. And I'm going to talk to you about it in terms of a ladder. And this is my idea. Calling it a ladder. I'm going to introduce 8 levels of motivation. That's motivation particularly about speaking in English, speaking L2, or other languages if you're teaching other languages. I'm going to share some experiences of teaching on different rungs of that ladder system. And then I'm going to share some ideas for how to move people up to higher motivation, higher levels on the ladder. Okay, so I think perhaps everybody's wondering why choose a ladder. About a year ago, we had a CLIL course. We had a group of Swiss teachers came to IHWO Bristol, and they, before they came, they sent me emails about what they wanted to address. And the biggest problem they all seemed to have was motivating their learners. And the emails suggested that they didn't all have the same problems. Some of them had serious problems with behavior, and some of them just had learners who were a bit bored or a bit sleepy. And some of them had very good learners and they wanted to motivate more. So that was the situation. And I looked on the internet. And I went to lots of different websites. The different websites all just seemed to list a lot of ideas, but they weren't very specific to any particular kinds of students. And my experience is more that I've taught many different classes, and I feel like my classes have a particular identity. And I felt that the things I saw on the websites were in contrast to that experience of tailoring my approach to different identities of classes. So I'm going to just say why I think it matters. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this book. This is Visible Learning for Teachers by John Hattie. He is a New Zealand researcher, and he's done a lot of meta research by collating research that was done all over the world on what kinds of things improve learning, and that's why he calls it visible learning. Now, one of the things he's found, he talked about key dispositional ingredients in learners, and he gave a long list of these, but he basically saying that these dispositions are the key, and they're a key to performance indicators. Now, this backs up my past experience of classes, either with high motivation or low motivation, and this is why I think it's important. So I'm going to talk about what the 8 rungs are first, and we'll start at the top and work our way downwards. And as we go through them, you can see if some of them are familiar from your teaching, and you may recognize a number or possibly even all of them. Just before we start, I just want to remind you, these are levels of activation and motivation, and they're not necessarily the same as language levels, because we have the 8 IH levels of language ability, but these are levels of motivation. And I have currently got a level 3 class who are fairly near the top of this ladder, because they're just so motivated and they do so much with their English. So we'll start. Here's the first level. The first level is The Incredibles, and I've given this little cartoon picture here. And the Incredibles have fully developed independent study skills. You ask them to do something and they just get on and do it. They do stuff without you asking them as well. They spend so much time in the target language in L2, they may even dream in L2. They really are incredible. And possibly your problem will be that you begin to wonder what your job is. What can you do to help these people? Or maybe you feel like they don't need you at all. It's a problem I've had a couple of times in the past, and I'll give some ideas later about what I've done in that situation. The next level down, I'm going to call going for gold. Now, these are the people who they would like to be the Incredibles and probably will be in the future. They're very fluent, very capable students. So fluency level doesn't hold them back, and they get on and do stuff all the time. They find the study materials interesting. You put things in front of them and they just dive straight in. And they still need a good coach because they're not the Incredibles yet. The next level down, I'm going to call them workers of the world, because they're industrious. They work, they get on and do their jobs. But yeah, so they do carry on speaking L2 even when your back is turned, mostly. But they might be reluctant with some topics. So there might be just some things or some activities they don't like doing, particularly quite often speaking. So they'll be happy to get on with the gap fill, but maybe they're not so keen on speaking in the lesson. And they may have confidence issues around some areas. So that's the workers of the world, and we'll go on now to the next group down. I've called lost for words, and these are people who are genuinely motivated. They do really want to speak, but they often can't find the right words. So there are sort of motivational issues about speaking, and they often dry up when they're trying to speak in class. And they often feel self-conscious in front of peers. So maybe they're happy to speak on their own in the bathroom in front of a mirror, but when they're in a class with a lot of other teenagers, they don't feel so keen to speak. You also may have a group of these at the back of your classroom with a group at a higher level at the front, and these guys may sometimes hide behind your other students. So the next level down I've called backsliders, and are a bit similar to somebody who goes on a diet but keeps sneakily reaching for a sandwich or something when he thinks that nobody's looking. And these are people who have accepted that they need to speak, and they will speak in L2 for short periods of time in the class. It does happen. But as soon as they have a problem, as soon as they have the first sign of trouble, they switch back to L1. And they don't know enough L2 to say anything very interesting. So they'll do the little task that you give them and speak for 35 seconds, but when they get to the end of it, when they want to chat with their friends, it's back to L2. And the next group down I'm going to call tongue-tied, because they've taken the problem a stage further and they hardly speak at all. So they understand that they should try to speak in L2, but for one reason or another, it's really difficult and they just don't say very much. There is one person in the classroom who does speak a lot of L2, but unfortunately, it's you, the teacher, or me, the teacher. That's been my experience. The next level down, it's a bit difficult to decide where to put them, but I put them on level 2, and I'm calling them the exam slaves. And there are other levels where people are probably doing exams, but these are the people who are doing exams not because they love the language or because they're interested, but because they have to. And they're very unhappy about it. And they have no intrinsic interest in the language, but they must study it for this important exam. And unfortunately for them, the exam requires them to speak. And for a lot of these students, that's the worst possible part of that. Okay, and now the final group, the final level, who I'm referring to as the challengers. I was told I'm not allowed to call them a zoo class, so these guys are the challengers. And maybe you should imagine that you're going into class to face a sumo wrestler, because these people don't want to be in your lesson at all. They are only in the class under duress. At best, they count the seconds till the class ends. That's on a good day, because on a bad day, they may turn against you, and they may gain popularity points with their mates through acts of defiance, and that is a problem. So before we go on, I'm just going to ask, because there's quite a few people here now, which rungs do you work on at the moment, or have you experienced in the past? I think I've probably experienced all of these levels. I can definitely remember some challenges, particularly from my early teaching days. And yes, I can, yeah, all of those. Yes, yeah, backsliders and lost for words, yes. Certainly one upper teen group, yes. Yeah. All of them, yes. From challengers to the workers in the world, well, maybe we can help you move them up higher. Yes, level 5 especially, the lost for words people, 4 and 5. Okay, yes, okay. Yes, so a lot of people in lower levels are very tongue-tied, yes. Yes, so yeah, lots of people saying that, yeah, the lower levels seem to be a problem. Yeah. Oh, so somebody here's got some people on the 8th rung, some really motivated incredibles. Yeah. And somebody's typing. Yes. So yes, we have some 7 and 8s as well. That's good to hear. I'm going to go on. I'm going to start talking about the different levels and what I do with those levels. Because we don't have so much time, I'm not literally going to go through 8 levels one at a time. I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on the first 2, and then I'm going to join some of the others together. I hope you don't feel too cheated. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is, starting at the bottom, the challenges. And before we say any more, these are the assumptions that I start with. They are young and they're human, so somewhere inside there they must want to learn. And they all have interests that learning to speak L2 can be relevant to. I don't know how many people here teach English, but certainly on the internet in English there are materials about every possible topic that they can find out about when they reach a high enough level of English. And I'm sure it's the same for other languages as well. And you can challenge them to make moral choices as a group. And my experience is that even the most horrible classes can rise to that challenge and can make moral choices. So first of all, I'm going to start with some things that I think you shouldn't do. These are my don'ts. The first don't is don't lose your temper. And from my experience, on occasions, particularly in my first year or so of teaching, when I lost my temper, I'd lost the battle. It was just the end of everything, and there wasn't very much I could do with the class afterwards. Something else, and it's connected with that, I would say, don't shout. It's a really bad idea to shout, raise your voice. If you can bring your voice down, you are lowering the aggressive temperature of the room, and that makes a big difference as well. And I know this is a convention in a lot of schools that you have a procedure for sending students out, and maybe if you send one student out, that helps. But from my experience, any more than one, the students are losing, and it's they may even come to see it as a fun way of getting out of the lesson by getting themselves sent out, and it may actually become something they aim for rather than fear. I would also say don't be nasty. You can control a class by making them fear you, but I've never found it effective, and I just have lots of memories from my school days of teachers who I hated and whose subjects I ended up hating as a result. And the next one is don't be boring. And this I know is difficult because to not be boring, you have to understand your students, and to understand your students, you have to have some kind of dialogue. But if you're boring, they will probably play up. So you have to find some way to be the most interesting person in the room. And the final one is don't depart from your school's code of conduct, because you might be tempted to be the nice, fun teacher who lets them eat sandwiches in class, or who lets them use their phones, or lets them speak in their language. But your colleagues are not going to be happy with you, and I don't think in the end the students will respect what you're doing or learn more. So I would say don't do that. Here are the do's, the positive things. The first one is do use fresh material. Just as an example, if you think about some of the material you use, how many people use teaching material that was published in or before 2007? Just see if anybody. Oh, okay. Well, also Robin's typing quite often. Yes. Well, just to think about that, if you're using something that was published in 2007, that is half the age of some of your students. So from their perspective, 2007 is half a lifetime ago, and all the pictures in those books will look to them very, very old and stale. Now, I know in practical terms it's very difficult to keep buying new course material and things, but yes, and it does make me feel old as well. That's one of the challenges and problems with teaching teenagers. Okay, let's go for another one. Yes, this is another idea, is to move nearer to the students. Again, something I experienced in Greece. One problem class I had in my second or third year of teaching, most of the problems went away when I picked up the chair from behind a desk on a stage and walked towards the group of students at the far end of the classroom, sat down nearer to them. And just by doing that, half the problems went away. Another idea, find out about the learners. Find out as much as you can about them, because you're going to need that to making the material and lessons relevant to them and becoming less boring. Okay, so here's another one. Encourage the controlled use of phones. Oh yes, somebody's saying rewards there. Yes, yes, I agree with that. Now the idea about phones is that you'll find, I'm sure, that teenagers love their phones. Their whole lives happen on their phones, maybe. And if you can bring those phones into the lesson and allow them to use it in a controlled way, then they will find the lesson more interesting and stimulating. and that can help to raise their motivation. Another one is giving genuine praise. Now, if you have even the most difficult student, they will do something good at some point, and you just have to catch them at the right moment, catch them doing something good, and then praise them. And I've found that has a very positive effect. I've done that maybe every summer for the last 4 or 5 years in our summer schools. And another one is create customized material. So if you're giving examples on the whiteboard about the passive, the third conditional, try not to use ready-made examples with people called John and Mary. If you can use the names of the students in the room, and even better than that, some information about the people, about real information about those students to include it. And the final one, yes, create class rules posters. This is something we do in our school at the beginning of every summer, and probably every 2 or 3 weeks after that. We spend about 15 or 20 minutes talking about rules and then putting them together on a poster. And I'm just going to show you one of these. This one is about 4 days old, 5 days old. This one is actually created by a Chinese group that we have in the school right now. And we make these posters right at the beginning of their time. And as you'll see down here, everybody signs it. And I think that the time spent agreeing on a code is more than made up for by the time you save later, because everybody has these rules that they all agree about. Okay, so that's about the challenges. Let's go on to talk about the exam slaves. Now, if you're teaching exams, you're probably teaching exams that were written for adults. Unfortunately, these exams are then taken by teenagers. And there's this mismatch all the time. I don't think that's too much of a problem, because in the end, the teenagers are studying to become adults. And in the end, the one thing they all want to do is become adults as quickly as possible. And very often they want to be treated more like adults. The problem is that the exams may not be that interesting to students. And that's what you have to work on. Now, I do think you need to know the exam inside out. You need to know every tiny little detail, because the students will be obsessed with that, and you have to be obsessed with it too. And I just think that just because the exam is boring, it doesn't mean the classes have to be. I'm going to show a couple of ideas in a minute. So first of all, don't demoralize the students by giving them full strength exam questions on the first day. You have to build things up slowly. Don't overdo the past papers. I remember my first and second year of teaching, working in a school where the dominant teaching method was do a past paper, then do another past paper. And somewhere around the third year, they discovered there was a course book. And I think that's a much better idea. Don't do whole lessons on one skill. Now, we have to think about this a little bit. In our school, we have 90-minute lessons, and I don't know how long the lessons are in other places. But in a 90-minute lesson, we would aim to cover 3 or 4 parts of the exam, not just one. Now, if you have a shorter lesson, maybe you could do 2. What's this one instead? Don't encourage cheating. It might be amusing for the students, but it's not going to help them in the end. So let's go into the do's. Do use graded materials, and there are lots of nice course books for every exam that's out there, and the good ones start with easy materials and easy topics and slowly build up. And do teach exam strategies right from the start, because this is a way that students can, within the rules of the exam, take better approaches, and it's good for the students. Do early on in the course provide scaffolding. I'm going to talk a little bit more about scaffolding later, but this is just basically giving them gapped dialogues that they can put their own information in, gapped sentences that they can build their own ideas with, that fit the style and the approach of the exam. Do write exam-style texts around the students' interests. I know this is going to take lots and lots of extra time for teachers, but the payoff is so great that I think it's really, really worth it. And do offer a varied diet. Okay, now I've got here just one little example that I've created. This is designed to reflect the style and approach of a particular exam that our students do a lot. And you can get the students to create these themselves. You might have to make your own example first, but when they see what you're doing, they will have a lot of fun creating them, and they can give them to each other. They can give them to other groups to do, and it gives them a real insight into the actual thinking and the internal logic of the exams in a fun and engaging way, or at least that's been my experience. Okay, and I think we're going to move on now to the next group. Yes, I've put the tongue-tied and the backsliders together. Now, I think one of the big problems for both of these groups is that speaking in L2 does expose young learners to fear of humiliation. It can be very, very embarrassing if their mates don't think it's cool to speak in your language that you're trying to teach them. The learners do also experience a big step down in what they can say. So they'll be chattering away in their own language, and suddenly they're down to 4 syllables every 10 seconds in a foreign language, maybe. And you do often find a sort of hinterland of quieter people not saying much, hiding behind a few more engaged and positive students who sit at the front and always put their hands up. So the first thing I think is important is to create a positive atmosphere, because if everybody feels supported in the classroom, then they're more likely to want to actually open their mouths and speak. And so to do that, I would start by thanking every student, even if their contributions are wrong or they're poor. So every contribution gets some kind of praise or appreciation. Another thing is when they're doing pair work, group activities, speaking, at the beginning, there can be a deathly silence, and the first person to speak doesn't want to break that silence. And if you just play a bit of quiet music in the background, then they feel much more inclined to have a go and open their mouths and speak. And they're less likely to tune in and listen to other groups as well. You can have L1 breaks or even an L1 corner. Obviously, you don't want it to take over, but if you have do it in a very limited way, then it should help. And this is something that I've found research about on the internet, is that a lot of English schools are doing this, is to move away from the hands-up classroom culture. So you've got your little group at the front who always put their hands up, and if you can move away from that to something different, then you'll involve a larger proportion, a larger percentage of the people in the room. And the final one is to adopt a positive attitude to errors. So both in writing, but especially in speaking, when students say something that is wrong, as well as correcting them, thank them and say how useful and instructive that error is for everybody else, that everybody can learn from. Because if they feel positive about making errors, they won't be afraid so much to open their mouths and make them. And the other thing is to have regular group forming activities. So keep doing activities where people share information about themselves, and get to know each other and feel like a cohesive group. So here's an example I'm just going to show you of a technique that I've tried a few times that I first saw in a BBC video called The Classroom Experiment. I don't know if anybody's seen that. There is a link to that at the end of the talk. Some British state schools have actually been experimenting with this idea to nominate people instead of just having people put their hands up. If you'd like to watch the following video, this is an example from one of my classes.
My computer's just
Okay.
If you go to pods.
Okay, I'm having instructions on how to run the video here. So the question is, how does the teacher select which student is going to answer next? Pods. And then
share.
Then share.
Go across and click on the video.
And it's the nomination one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just
So,
reboot.
okay, with a bit of luck, you are about to see a video. And press play. Okay, let's just nominate somebody. So, Sasha, what do you think? Personally, what does it mean? Say it. And it stopped. When to go Friday. Yeah. Strike one in there. Yeah. Yes. That's normal. Dimitri, well, I'm the okay, let's just in our group who is more of the snacks, who eats most of the snacks. So okay, I apologize for the stuttering delivery. Nominate somebody, so Sasha. For any student. And just one of each. What do you think? Are you kind of in the same category as Dimitri? Okay, so there's the video. How do I make it go away? Okay, I hope some of you were able to see that. Basic idea is that every student's name is written on a little slip of paper or a stick in a cup, and you randomly take them out of the cup one at a time, and depending on how you want to do it, you can either leave the sticks on the table once they've been taken, or you can put them back into the cup to make it truly random. And the idea of this is that people don't know when they're going to be selected, so they're always ready to answer and ready to be engaged in this way. Okay, we're going to move on now. Yes, this is the other idea, is to provide support. Now, this is what I would call scaffolding, and this is the idea of giving people some language before they have to speak to help them with what they're going to do. One idea is to use write first, then speak. Now, I used to do this with very low-level Japanese students when I was teaching in a conversation school in Japan. I would get them to write answers, or the first sentence of an answer, to a number of questions on little pieces of paper, A6 size like this, and then get them to speak to each other, having rehearsed in their mind what they were going to say at the beginning. And it was a remarkable improvement. It really made such a difference between being completely held back by not knowing what to say and being able to open their mouths and say the first sentence. Another idea is to use model dialogues. Now, this is obviously something that's in a lot of course books already, but you can write your own. You can write your own with the names of the students in the class. And they can either be recorded or they could just be written, and the students could perform them together before they go on to customize them and make them their own dialogues afterwards. Okay, and then another idea is, as I said, to provide scaffolding for more challenging tasks. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. And another idea is to set monologue recording as video homework. And this is something we've started doing in the school now. I've done it a few times, and some other teachers have. Is that you ask the students to, instead of write homework, is to use their phones to record themselves saying something, explaining something to the camera or the video, or just recording the sound, and then they either play it in the lesson, or in some cases they can even email the audio to the teacher, and then we can listen to it. I'm going to show you an example now of scaffolding. This is an activity from one of our junior summer booklets that we have. Maybe one or two people even might recognize it. And this is an idea of a balloon debate that we do with intermediate students, sort of between level 5 and level 6 in the IHWO scale. And you imagine 10 teachers flying in a balloon which gets a leak, and the balloon is sinking towards a swamp, and they have to decide which teachers to throw out of the balloon based on the subjects that they teach. Sounds a horrible idea to teachers, but for some reason teenagers think it's fun. Anyway, how would you approach getting students to do that? If you give them that task cold, they will just sit there and not say very much. So my idea, and an idea I found works very well, is to show them some arguments, some ready-made written arguments for one subject, and I've taken science as an example, and they have to, they read through those, and then they identify which of the grammar structures that they already know have been used in those sentences. So they're noticing when they do that the particular grammar structures used and how the sentences are formed and how they're structured. And then they can go on to customize these sentences and use them as the basis of their arguments for saving other teachers. And I found this works very, very well. And it saves the students from just thrashing around, not knowing where to start, and tending to use very, very basic, simple grammar when they do actually know better and more advanced stuff. Okay, I think I'm going to move on now to workers of the world. Now, these are guys who have made it to a level where they can communicate quite a lot, and they're doing pretty well, but they become demoralized as progress becomes less visible, and you probably recognize this as a description of the intermediate plateau. Now, with these students, you also find speaking can include a lot of fossilized errors, lots of things that are very low-level errors but occur with students at a higher level. And language points are sometimes only accurate in the lessons when you've just taught them. And when you introduce some topics, the fluency goes down. So one of my ideas, solutions, is to include some planning time before speaking activities. And that could just be thinking time. So before students have to open their mouths and speak, they have 1 minute to think, or they could have 1 minute to jot down some ideas. People who teach IELTS will recognize this as something that happens in every IELTS speaking exam, but it's something I've done a lot speaking in classes, and I found it really helps. Another idea is to have ongoing posters that you keep adapting and updating with top 10 errors or the most wanted words for the words that students are most often searching for and can't find. And Another idea is to teach circumlocution phrases or phrases and strategies for saying things when they don't know what to say, because there are phrases that native speakers use. You only have to listen to politicians who smoothly say 4 or 5 phrases while they're desperately trying to construct their arguments in their heads. And those are the kinds of phrases we should be giving to our students to help them. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And one further idea is, which I've mentioned before, is to adapt authentic texts which are related to the students' interests and things that they would be more interested in reading about. So just as an example, some people might recognize this. This is something from our website. We have 150 pages like this, which contain phrases that students can use, and they can say these almost like sort of automatically while their brains are trying to put together the next sentence that they're going to say. So it's a typical thing, again, that politicians might say is what it all boils down to is, and by the time they've said that phrase, they've got something there, they've got something in their head that they're ready to say then. Okay, so some further ideas. This is something we found helps, is to use a test-teach test cycle. And the idea of this is that you start your class with a speaking task. And you do this to demonstrate to the students that there are gaps in their knowledge, and there's what I would call a language deficit. So there are things that they very clearly need in order to do that speaking task. And then you devote time to teaching it. And then at the end of the class, you give them the same speaking task to do, possibly with different students, so they don't feel they're exactly saying the same things absolutely again to the same people. I've usually do this with a very clear idea of what I'm going to teach. So I know that the students are going to struggle using conditionals, and that they're not going to use conditionals in making their suggestions, for example. And then once they've demonstrated that in the test stage, I can then go on, present some examples, present them with some structured practice activities, and then they can do the same the same activity, the same speaking task at the end of the class. Another thing I've often done, and in fact I suspect I may have invented this task, is I use something called the grab it game. And this idea is to have phrases that I want the students to use on cards. These are phrases that perhaps they're not using in their speaking, but they could be using to sound more natural, more fluent, more native speaker-like. And I put them on cards, and then they pick up and take the phrases as they use them. Now that might sound familiar to you. The slight adjustment to the game that I think I've introduced was that the cards do not then belong to the students. They don't go out of play. They can then be taken by other students who can continue to use those phrases. If you play this for 5 minutes, the idea is that the winning student who uses more of the phrases will have more of the cards on the table in front of them. I will show you a video of that in a second. And another idea would be to change your course book to a more task-based one. Anyway, we're just going to watch a little video clip of a grab it game. This was a grab it game in a class that we actually did earlier this week with adult students. I apologize that they're not teenagers. And they are trying to use phrases to talk about money and purchases that they've made. And I hope the video will perhaps stutter a little bit less than the previous one. Stop. That's stuttering a bit. Can we pause it there? Yeah, just stop it. Okay, I think we've seen enough. Certainly here it does seem to be stuttering rather a lot. I don't know if everybody else is having that experience. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about the winners, the Incredibles and the Going for Gold people. Now, the good thing about them, of course, is that they will learn with or without you. But you still have a responsibility to try and do something useful for them, to make yourself useful. And I think basically the idea is that you're more of a facilitator now, and perhaps slightly less of a teacher in the traditional sense. Now, the other thing is that high flyers do have surprisingly basic gaps in their knowledge, and you'll have people even at the higher levels still not dropping the third person S, for example. And some individuals in these groups may have very different personal ambitions from the normal ones that are assumed in your syllabus, and you may find they want some strange and particular things that you might be able to help with. And the other one is that they often passively know lots of vocabulary, but they don't actually use that much of it. They might know 5,000 words, but perhaps they only use 2,000 in their speaking. And maybe you can train them in a sort of like coach-like way to use a higher proportion of that language. As a general approach, I think you obviously need to find out as much as you can about your learners and what are their ambitions and what are their interests. So the more personalized you can make the lessons, the more they're going to appreciate it. And I think at this level, grammar does give way to Lexis rather a lot, and you're going to be focusing a lot more on collocation and how they can make their speech and writing more natural in that way. The other thing you can do is you can do deals. In a minute, I'm going to show you an example of one such deal that I did with an advanced junior group last summer. And the other thing is to teach the skill of noticing. And this is something that they will then be able to take away from the classroom. This is the idea that when they read, they should not only be reading for pleasure and reading in a sort of absorbing way, but they should also be actively going back and analyzing those texts and saying, aha, I didn't know that that verb has that preposition. Okay, so this is an example I'd like to show you or play you of a request that I had from a group of students last summer. They were a very strong group. We were doing lots of different topics, and one day, out of the blue, they just suddenly said, we're very bad at conjunctions, and we don't really know what we're doing with them sometimes, and we need to use them in the exam. Can you find us a song with conjunctions? So I went and I looked, and I didn't find very much in the way of the song. And because there was a piano in the school, and because I can just about bang out a tune on one, I thought I'd have a go at writing a song for them. And this is what resulted. Now I'll just move on to the next slide. This is the song. And as I did with the students, I left the conjunctions blank. And if you'd like to just look through the first verse and the first chorus and see if you can imagine what those conjunctions might be for a second, and then I'll play you the song. So any idea what number one might be? And the clue is that it rhymes with low. Yes, that's it. It's so. Yes, good. Yes. And then the next one rhymes with stuck in a rut. And it's but. Yes, good. And everybody's got that. Next one's a bit trickier. The third one, because it's 3 words, and it's followed by a noun. Oh yes, you near. Yes, okay. In spite of. There we are. In spite of. And then the last one down here. No, not quite. Okay, but it's this is the purpose. This is the purpose of doing it. So okay, well, I'll play the song and you can see. Oh, somebody. So yeah, there you are. You've got it. It's so that. Anyway, here's the song. I hope you like it. I apologise for my singing, but somebody has to sing it. And can anybody hear that? I can't.
My students want a song with conjunctions. So
my students want a song with conjunctions. So I've searched across the internet, both high and low. I went through 20,000 links on Google, but 5 hours later I was stuck in a rut. And in spite of all my efforts and working for so long, I couldn't even find a single grammar song with conjunctions in the lyrics for my lesson, so that it would be a bit less boring than the cat on the mat. So if, but because it's a conjunction song, I guess you won't remember it for very long. And I know it's not the greatest song, but nevertheless, I'm hoping that you'll recognize I've given my best. Now the words get quite repetitive in this verse due to the number of conjunctions that we need to go through. And as long as it's all grammar and not quite so much fun, there isn't that much chance that it'll get to number 1. But the songs you find on YouTube are more popular, whereas they haven't got conjunctions quite like this song has. And while it may be true that Lady Gaga is more cool, she won't exactly help you learn those grammar rules. And if, but because it's a conjunction song, I guess you won't remember it for very long. And I know it's not the greatest song on earth, despite the fact that I've been working on.
Okay, so there it is. That's the conjunction song. And the students were very positive about it. They seemed to enjoy it, and that's why I thought you might appreciate it as well. And I think I've got just a couple more things to mention. Yes, just a couple of other teaching ideas for the top most motivated people. This is another idea, reformulation. So whenever they're speaking, after they've spoken, take some of the things they said in perhaps rather more basic language and show them more advanced and better things they could use to say it with. And yes, lots of games, particularly games to activate passive vocabulary, like the Grab It game I showed earlier. And another idea is that students could bring in text or web video that they've sourced, and they could almost lead the lesson, possibly, if you're happy to let them do that. And I almost mentioned this earlier, this is the idea of encouraging them to read twice. So they read that's something they're interested in first because they're interested in their reading the content, and then they go back and they have a particular study focus in mind each day. So they could be looking at the articles one day, they could be looking at reference words like this and such another day. And these are things I do a lot with my learners. Okay, now I think we've got to the end. Yes, there's the ladder going up to heaven. And these are my favorite ideas for each of the levels on the ladder. And we have at the top my idea of teacher as facilitator, and encouraging that independence in the levels, in the rung 7 people, trying to convert obedience to enthusiasm with the workers of the world, building scaffolding with the people who don't know what to say, using write then speak, using a supportive atmosphere with the tongue-tied, relating exams to students' lives with the exam slaves, and personalizing learning, especially with the challenges. I hope some of those ideas somewhere in there have been interesting. I apologize if there's a lot of stuff there that you've seen before. And if there are any questions, oh, well, thank you very much. Ah, yes. Now that is a very important question. Yes, having students at different levels of enthusiasm in the same class. It is a very difficult position to be in, but I think you have to be a bit of a plate spinner in that sort of magical trick where you're doing something to tweak one group of students, and then doing something to tweak another group of students, and trying to keep it all moving and working at the same time. But yes, that is a question that's perhaps worthy of another talk almost, because that is a very big problem.
And thank you, Charlie. I think we all got a lot out of that talk.
There's a little bit of links there if anybody is interested. So IHWO Bristol Expressions. The BBC documentary I mentioned is 2 one-hour programs, very, very interesting. John Hattie talking about the most important findings from his visible learning, and a couple of other links there as well. So I hope there's something that's useful for people.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what we said before, here in the box I'm moving around in the corner, you can actually download these files. If you just click on it, and when it goes blue, then you can download the file and you can read these in your own time. So thank you very much, Charlie. And if you would like to join me in giving some applause to Charlie, just click on the arrow by the little man, and then you can start applauding. Everyone needs a bit of applause. And yes, if there are no more questions, can we download the PowerPoint file? You can't actually download them, but I think if you ask Charlie nicely, he might be able to email it to you.
Yes, it is about 3 megabytes, I think. But maybe if I took some of the images out, maybe. Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, I'm just about to stop the recording, so thank you very much, everyone.